I think my father is an unintentional feminist. I never actually thought I had limits, to be honest. I became very used to working in between the lines.
This is really what, Mosaic Mind podcast is about. Hello. This is May Holland, your host for Mosaic Mind. ESG, identity, and coming home on her own terms. So this is the story we're going to talk about, with Van Lee. So Van Lee was born in Chicago to Vietnamese parents who fled their homeland in April 1975. She grew up between cultures, between gratitude and silence, between visibility and restraint. Her path would eventually lead her to Beijing, Washington, D.C., Tibet, and finally to Ho Chi Minh City. But it wasn't just a physical journey. It was a return to language, purpose, and self. Today, Van is a partner at Raise Partners, a woman-led ESG and sustainable development consultancy based in Vietnam. She also serves as co-chair of AmCham ESG committee and sits on the board years ago of Avaz, a global grassroots movement. Her work sits at the intersection of corporate citizenship, not-for-profit impact and social change, and is fueled by a quiet, unwavering belief in inclusion, equity, and voice. So her story is not just about professional milestone. It's about resisting the pressure to explain her identity, about finding a way to belong in Vietnam without being fluent at first. And I feel you completely, Van, at that moment, but knowing the language of diplomacy before knowing how to order lunch, and really about standing her ground as a feminist, as a Viet Kieu, a daughter of refugees, while building something bigger than herself. In this episode of Mosaic Mind, we talk about ESG through the lens of identity. We ask how purpose evolves across life stages and what it means to return to the places our parents once fled, and what leadership looks like when it's shaped by culture, contradiction, and community. Welcome, Van. That was a long introduction, but you have so much, and I'll try just to gather all those identity, all those stuff that you shared with me a month ago when you were still in Vietnam, me from Australia. Have I captured it right? Have I missed something, or have I said that you went to Tibet and you didn't go? And I wasn't too sure about that one.
I was thinking that was a stunning introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all those kind words. No, it was amazing. I did go to Tibet, but I only went as a student for very short.
No, okay. So I have so many questions here. So I really, really love, what you're doing in Vietnam. And, you have done so much, and I really, really want you to share, a few things, with the audience today. So let's talk a little bit more about identity, belonging. So this is really what Mosaic Mind podcast is about. So you have described feeling caught between identities. So being American, Vietnamese, feminist, daughter of refugees. So what part of that mosaic felt the clearest for you early on? And what took time for you to understand all those many, mosaics of identity for you?
I would actually reclassify that a little bit. Daughter of Chinese Vietnamese refugees, growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, then moved here, and then felt very, very American. And I think that what carries me through the themes of the different stages of my life is that I became very used to working in between the lines. So not necessarily belonging to one thing or another, but actually being that comfortable in the gray of all those boxes, right? So what I will say is I remember as a kid, my mom asked me, I came home from school and I asked her, I must have been like first grade or second grade or something. I asked her where we were from because people kept asking me where I was from. And she said very angrily and very firmly to tell those people that I was 100% American. And me, even knowing as a child back then that is not the intention of that question, right? The intention of the question is, why do you look different? How are you different? Where are you from that makes you different? So I remember going back to school saying, I'm 100% American, but knowing that actually the intent of that question was to say, I'm the daughter of immigrants, of refugees that left Vietnam a few years before I was born, and now we're here. And this is who I am, right? But I was actually lucky and fortunate to grow up in a super progressive town, Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And at the time, even it's uncomfortable in its position as a suburb between different areas of Chicago, low income areas of Chicago, and then high, rich suburbs to the west. Uh, and really being very, when I was growing up, one thing that was a theme in every class, every grade, was this idea of promoting diversity. So they may not have always done that elegantly. So really trying to make sure that everyone had a voice, because it was a very diverse place between African Americans, Latino Americans, and Latinx, I should say, and then this emerging population of Asians that were coming up through the town. And so figuring out how to talk about our different cultures, how to celebrate those things across the year, I became very comfortable in communicating about myself and my culture because I grew up in a community that enabled me to do those things. And then next going to university, looking for an international community in university, wanting to work in international relations or international development, politics also helped me, I think, solidify communicating what culture meant to me.
That is awesome. So you talked about, that moment in time. And I want to come back to another moment in time, especially with your mother, I think, when you had your first trip to Vietnam when you were 22, I think, something like that. And then you later returned to stay. And this is where you are now. So you're still staying. Can you tell us a bit more of that experience of when you were 22 and now? So what surprised you most about being in the country of your parents? What do they tell you? What have they told you? What haven't they told you? What was that hidden stuff behind, that, us as Asian, we don't always hear everything. So what was the hidden story?
So when I was growing up, Oak Park is very close to the Vietnamese community in Chicago. It's like 40 minutes away. But my parents very much mostly kept me separate from that. So we only went to the Vietnamese and the Chinese areas of Chicago on the weekend to buy food, bring it back, eat.
It sounds
I
very
didn't
Asian.
really engage with that community as much as, say, my cousins, or I wasn't integrated into that community. So when I studied as a student, I went to Beijing when I was 20. Actually, that was the first time I tried to connect to what I thought was my culture. And I went to Beijing, and my father is Cantonese. And so I went to a different part of the country and then tried to see if I felt some kind of roots. I did and I didn't. I enjoyed it. I loved it. I love China. I love Beijing. But then it wasn't until my mom, when I graduated from university, she gifted me a trip to Vietnam. And so I had heard many stories about Vietnam. I knew that, so most of my family is actually in Vietnam. My parents and my uncle and one aunt were the only ones that had left Vietnam and gone to the US, to Germany. And so I did not know what to expect when I got there. What I had learned from my experience traveling in Beijing was to come with no expectations. With Vietnam, that was a little bit harder because I had been told some stories, and all of those stories were stories of hardship, right? Stories of war. So going into Vietnam, I tried to keep a very open mind, but immediately what I was met with was a wall-to-wall welcoming party, at Tân Sơn Nhất Airport, of all my aunts and uncles that I've never met before. And so to go from knowing one uncle my entire life and then having to memorize names and the numbers of this wall of people who all very clearly, number one, so much love for me who they've never met, which was also a very strange feeling, right? I lacked language skills to be able to communicate with them, but that was my first impression of Vietnam, was seeing this wall-to-wall group of people that were super excited to see us, super excited to reconnect with my mom, and then meet my sister as well. And then I went off 2 weeks hanging out with this family that I've never met before. That was the most, I would say, surprising or stunning thing to me in that moment. And I know it sounds funny, but as the daughter of refugees, you sort of are centered in the moment they left Vietnam, right? Those are the stories that you hear about. And what was amazing to me was to see images of my mom as a kid, as a teenager, right? Growing up, and to realize that she had this whole rich life before she came to the US that I had no idea about.
Right.
And to hear stories, to hear all of that history, even it's a short history, right? It's just the one generation behind. And then to start to learn about other things that that was like the most thrilling thing. Suddenly I have history, right? Suddenly I have, decades of history behind me that I had no idea about.
I know what you just said. Suddenly I have a history.
So even that question, like, who are you? Where are you from? As a first grader, I don't know. Then all of a sudden it opens up into this amazing trip. And then I came back a year later with my mother again, and then started to think about making the move.
Yeah. Because when we chatted weeks ago, months ago, you mentioned to me that you could speak, you studied, right, Asian studies, right? So you couldn't understand complicated things in Chinese, but not in Vietnamese. So when you come to Vietnam, it was a bit of a gap, like linguistic gap. What happened there?
I think what I also mentioned too was as a kid, I got used to blocking Vietnamese out because it was a language I didn't know. So when I heard it being spoken in my house, I just blocked it out. And then to intentionally decide to study Vietnamese in graduate school meant I had to keep unlocking my brain, which I had socialized closing off to Vietnamese, and try really hard to speak, to also get over my discomfort, coming from behind, coming from a point of weakness, not being able to speak Vietnamese properly, and then keep pushing myself to learn more and more. My Vietnamese is still not amazing, but it also helps unlock, right, that piece of you that is inside, right, to that culture that is there. I still don't speak Chinese either. My Chinese is also terrible, but so I find it easier to communicate in English.
Very good.
But yeah, but then continuing to push myself is important, and and and
Yeah.
and to sort of learn about Vietnam while you still can't completely communicate was not always easy. But, I mean, there's so much communication that happens non-verbally, right? And so learning about my
Mm,
family, learning about the country, what the country's been through, how people work, ways of working here, I managed.
yeah. Yeah. And I have been knowing you through, you have done so much. So I think, is it this year that you have organized, the third ESG conference in Vietnam? Can you tell us more about the context, how it started and now how it's continuing, obviously, because you're leading the way in the landscape in Vietnam.
Thank you, Jimmy. So it's a third year. What happened was maybe around 5 years ago, my business partner Mimi and I moved from the NGO sector, from the nonprofit and development sector, into embracing ESG and sustainability and starting a business. And we were doing that at a time when Vietnam also was starting to look at ESG frameworks, starting to talk about investment using the language of ESG, environment, social, and governance. And for us, it was really an entrance point into connecting private sector, government, nonprofit work, still contributing to the sustainable development of Vietnam, and using this framework as an entry point to help advance those things, especially as Vietnam was committing to net zero pathway, green and digital transformation. It all sort of made sense at one time. And what happened was 3 years ago, there were a lot of conversations being had between investors, between companies, Vietnamese companies and Western companies and foreign investors, and then governments and communities, but they were all having different segments of a conversation. And so what Mimi and I decided was that one of our superpowers is that we are very good at organizing people. We're very good at mobilizing people. And so we thought, why don't we have a conference that curates the conversations on ESG, on responsible investing, on responsible business in a way that we take those hot topics, we give it a lot of context of what the challenges and opportunities of investing in Vietnam look like, with the idea of environmental and social outcomes, and invite all of those parties, all those stakeholders to come together and discuss in a forum, right? And so now we just finished our third one. Each year has a different theme. The third year was sort of navigating through the uncertainty of our times because of 2025 has been such a disruption in so many ways, right, on the global market and domestically. And how do we make sure to continue to advance Vietnam's development given that context? And how do we continue to also, both externally, Vietnam looking at its trading partners externally, and also internally, how do we give ourselves more resilience, more strength in the market so that we can navigate the bumps?
Yeah, I mean, you have done so much. I've really been following you with all the work that you and Mimi have done. And I'm really interested in how is it different from only technical or policy terms that you see in other places. How is it for you when you bring that strong human lens to this work? Is it because of your background, in a lot of social work as well? How is it that you can put all this together?
So I think something that was really important to both Mimi and me, we're very similar background-wise. We've worked in NGO sector and development sector. And as part of that work, right, I think that both of us were moved by the fact that if the country is going to develop sustainably, that it needed to not leave anyone behind. That if we only focus on, for example, urban development or looking at trade and big partners, that the country, there would be a fragmentation. And so making sure that voices from marginalized communities, from low-income communities are included, from women who make up the majority, right? But in the world, but somehow we always end up in the marginalized category, right? How do we make sure that this development is inclusive? Again, we talk about the sense of belonging. Everyone has a place as we move forward together in one direction. And so in even the organization of the conference, what is very important to us is making sure that, for example, there are no what we call panels, right? They're not panels of foreign men who then tell Vietnam how things should be or how we should change A, B, and C, but making sure that those panels are diverse in terms of perspective, diverse in terms of both Vietnamese and foreign perspectives, companies and governments, and then also gender. And making sure to include, for example, issues on accessibility. How do we engage people with disabilities into the workforce? All of those questions we were very intentional about. And then, to be honest, we also wanted to show how easy it is once you put that intention into place, right? The first year, people thought it was very surprising that we had very gender balanced panels, that even in the issue areas, we were not only focusing on climate, but we were also focusing on social issues and integrating them together, right? That environment and social are not siloed. But then by the third year, actually, it became easy because we've been doing it this way the entire time. And that intention is there, the targets are there, and then we continue to do it that way. And using that as a way to also advocate that when we think about policy, when we think about big program development programs, that these things should be included, integrated, this idea of looking at gender, looking at social inclusion, making sure that everyone has a role to play. That's super important to me. I think that also comes from the fact that Mimi and I are sensitive to those issues as both people who've grown up in the US from Asian American backgrounds, from refugee backgrounds, and then also people who have been involved in development, caring about how do we uplift other communities alongside cities. It just is kind of natural for us, but I know that we are kind of the outliers, sort of like weirdos about that. But yeah, we're quite proud of that achievement as we move forward.
Not weirdos, Em, not weirdos. So you talk about gender, your gender work. So can you tell us a bit more, where is it coming from? Is it through how you grew up or the background with family, or where was that concept of feminism is coming from? What does it mean for you today, as the woman that you are today in 2025? And what do you think that feminism mean for you as, an American, Vietnamese, Chinese, from the US? How has that concept changed a bit, or how did you adapt it? How is it for you now?
I don't think the concept has changed. It's more like the context has changed, maybe, right? So in the US, I think my father is an unintentional feminist. So my father is a Chinese man. His family is were migrants moving from China into Vietnam when he was born. And then through the course of his life, he migrated from the north to the south, and then he left Vietnam in 1970. And in that time, he suffered a lot of hardship with his family, had a very hard childhood. His parents broke up. And so when he came to the US, I think he saw for himself and his children an opportunity. He thought to himself, he has two daughters, myself and my sister. And from the beginning of time, I can remember him telling me that he never wanted me to be dependent on anyone else, that I had to be self-sufficient, and that America was that place where I could do those things. That American dream of you can do anything. We are exceptional people, right? But that there was that possibility existed. And so I never actually thought I had limits, to be honest. I grew up probably very spoiled. I knew that if I dedicated myself to my education, and I could do the things that I wanted to do, I could go after the career I wanted to go after and not be dependent on, for example, a man. So that thought never really occurred to me. What changed for me, I think, in being a feminist, and also I grew up in a very progressive town. We talk about feminism all the time, and I was surrounded by male champions and also, strong female role models. But then what I think happened is when I moved to Vietnam, the context changed. So then I think I told you in our previous discussion too, you know, I didn't have gender norms. Like, I remember when I came here, my cousins were trying to instruct me on how to act as an elegant Vietnamese woman and make sure that my legs were covered, my shoulders were covered, and make sure that I was pouring water for all the men at the table, right? Because suddenly that was my job. And I didn't understand why they couldn't get their own water. Like small things like that. But they had grown up in that. And I'm not used to it. And so actually,
You
I
won't do it.
did try. I still won't do it. I did try actually because I wanted to I didn't want to disrupt whatever, community harmony there is or these things. But the problem is I didn't understand the rationale. Why do I have to do it? Why doesn't that guy do it? And then I had to learn how to talk about gender in, I think, a different way because it's coming from a different starting point. Luckily, I mean, in Vietnam too, I've been fortunate to have colleagues who are also male champions in the nonprofit sector, right, who looked out for me and helped me sort of understand the context in which I was working in. But yes, there would be moments where I came up against a wall and didn't understand why. Or I think I told you too this story where one time we were in a celebration of a new school or water system. And then the government guy asked me, very local, very super local, what room number was my hotel room. And I had never been in like a sexual harassment incident before. And then I remember looking at him like, and I said very innocently, like, why would you need to know my room number? And then I looked at my staff and I saw their faces like, and I went, I see, we're in a different conversation now. Okay, how do I get out of this? How do I get out of this very quickly, very elegantly without offending people? The shocking thing for me was the expectation that suddenly I would just answer like, oh, room 423. How did you think that was going to go? How did you think this conversation was going to go? But I think one thing that I will say about working in Vietnam may be different than working in the US is the Vietnamese are very practical people, right? So sometimes when we're talking about gender relationships or gender norms, for example, in a factory, for those factory managers, for the brand owners, they know 90, 80, 70% of their factory workers are women. And so when we talk about gender in the context of factory work, they know exactly why. They know exactly why we're talking about gender empowerment and what the need is, right? Why it's important to have maternity leave respected, why it's important to protect their jobs, all of those things, give them financial literacy. A lot of those owners already know because that is the context in which they're working. Whereas I remember when I was explaining our work to an American investor, and he said, "Oh, you do women's stuff. Why do you focus on women in Vietnam so much?" Because there is a need, there's an unmet need. We need to do it together because otherwise there will be outcomes in the future that will not be great, right, for the development of Vietnam. And how do we shift? How do we move? How do we close the gender gap? That I have no problem explaining that to Vietnamese people. Whereas I think in Western culture, they think, oh, we've finished. We've done all the things. The laws are in place. Everything's great.
And that's very interesting when you're talking about gender issues in the factories where you have mostly women doing the work down there, but not many in the leadership team. Gender issue is not a factory issue. What I'm really curious to hear your views. So when you say that you work in so many areas, many sectors, so I really want to know how challenging it was from moving from a type of big corporate to, more of a family style leadership. How did you navigate that as a non-local person? Because it's more than a leadership adaptation. It's, you talked about, the expectation, the gender norms here, expectation. How was it practically for you to move between all those, the big corp to, more of a family style, Vietnamese style kind of community thing? How was it really, for you to navigate those spaces?
It was the reverse.
That was the reverse.
I started in the nonprofit space, and honestly, because of the culture of that particular NGO, we were like a family. So the Vietnamese team for East Meets West Foundation is like a family. And the nature of each of those employees is that they go into communities and then they carry out project work. And so in a way, in a sense, each of those people have been empowered to be leaders in those communities where they're working. So when we come back together as a team, we are a team of leaders, right? and a team of people who have a lot of trust built in, because you have to trust those people to be able to go out into those communities and then come back and with those outcomes, right? And so I had been empowered in that team as a fundraising manager, as a communications manager, and then later as a program manager. And there was a lot of trust given to me, a lot of responsibility given to me, a lot of testing, right? Like, we're going to give her then the responsibilities, we're going to give her more work to do, more kinds of work to do, right? In a way that I always felt supported by my big brothers, by my big sisters in that organization, and then by our headquarters in the US. And so to move from that into a large corporate in which now I still was entrusted to do a lot of things because of where I entered the workforce was as a middle manager. I still was trusted by my supervisor and by the CEO to do a lot of things. But now I'm doing it within a context of 800, 1,000 people with different departments who are all jockeying, sometimes not in harmony with each other, right? And then having to ask for permissions for certain things because it's a bureaucracy in a way that I've never had to do before, right? Like suddenly having to ask 4 layers of permission to do one campaign. And that, just because it was so different, was very hard for me. Also, the teams are not, the people are, the corporate landscape is very competitive. And so sometimes you're competing internally. And I was not used to that, nor did I like it, because to me, it doesn't make any sense. And so when Mimi and I decided to start Raise, it was with the intention that, number one, we work better as a small team that's agile, that's flexible, that's adaptable, and can adjust to the demands of our client, right? But that we liked that. We liked that agility. We liked that flexibility, and we never want to be a giant. And when we think about our 20-year plan or 10-year plan or 5-year plan, we never want to be over 20 people, right? Like that's not who we are. We run better when we don't have layers of micromanagers above us. And so, yeah, that was also me thinking very carefully about cultures in terms of organizational culture and what kind of organizational culture we want to build for ourselves and we want to build with our clients.
I totally hear you on this one. So you have experience in, in a few countries, in a few cultures, as we talk today. And, people might listen, on podcasts based outside of Vietnam, and they might not know Vietnam. And I was just wondering if you can give them, an insight. What is it that you would like to export from Vietnam as, a mindset idea, an insight, whatever? What do you think that, you have learned from Vietnam that, people might like to practice outside, wherever they are?
I think so. What I love to tell people about Vietnam, when people ask me why do I stay so long, or why I plan to stay in the future, for me the question is very easy in the sense that, number one, if I compare U.S. and Vietnam, for example, Vietnam is a very young country still. I think still the majority of people are under 45 or 48, right? We are a very vibrant country in that we have developed so much over the course of the last 30 to 50 years. And so people are very ambitious. They're very aspirational still. And so that vibe, that dynamic is very hard to not get addicted to, because there's a joyful, right? There's a joyfulness in that aspiration and the sense of possibility. Like there's no limits, right, for the Vietnamese. That I love. And if you look at the United States now, which has such a contested environment, so politicized, so polarized, you don't feel that same way. And also the US is just so big. So when change happens very fragmented, very segmented, only in these places, right? And so Vietnam being a very populous country, but being a very small country, when change happens, it sweeps, right? You feel the sweep of it. And that is amazing, right? And so when people come to visit, I tell them about sort of my pride for what Vietnam has been able to achieve, what people in Vietnam still want to achieve in the future, and how I think that arc may happen, right? That excitement, that dynamism is something that you can't duplicate.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you on this one. You feel the vibes. It's impossible not to feel the vibes in Vietnam. So yeah, everybody's just like, like you really feel younger, even if you're not, but you feel younger.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I was just wondering, talking about advice here. So if you can speak to your 20-year-old self about, how to land in Vietnam for the first time, what would you say to Van Lee of 20 years?
I wouldn't change much, but what I would say is to take myself less seriously. Meaning really I did come in with sort of an open attitude, but even still I came in with a very American lens, which is fine. But what I would say is you should, okay, Van, you should try everything. Do everything. Work in all the different areas where you think you can have impact and meet lots of people, and don't let that doubt or fear stop you from trying new things. I would say that to myself in Vietnam. I would say that to myself in the US. I would say that to myself, the younger version of myself in any case, but that there is a space for you to try new things and to succeed and to fail and for all of those things to be okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Noted. And the last question. So a question that I ask to all my guests, but the podcast is called Mosaic Mind. So the question is, if your leadership journey is a mosaic made of fragments of identity, stories, insight, mistakes, bold choices, maybe regrets, what would be the glue for you that holds all your mosaic minds together?
Let me think about that for a minute. What's the glue?
I love that question.
I really like that question. I like that question so much. I think the glue is from the beginning, as I was trying to start my career, build my career. And then one question I kept in my mind was how individually myself, I could be the most effective person in the world. It doesn't mean, I want to win the Nobel Peace Prize. What that meant was me specifically with the resources and with the superpowers I have inside me. How could I be the most effective in terms of benefiting people around me? And then I will also say that, and so that thought has gone through all of those stages, but then it's been re-triggered by different moments, right? So one time I had a leadership coach, and I was complaining to her about my staff, or whatever it was, right? And then she stopped me and she said, I think you don't know what kind of leader you want to be. And so until you identify what kind of leader you want and what kind of impact you want to have on the staff that you have and also the other people that you're working with, you will be stuck in this place, in this like misery, like sadness. And that she wanted me to draw that out. She wanted me to literally draw on a piece of paper what kind of leader I wanted to be. And then after that, we started to map out how I was going to get there, what skills I would need, what skills I already have, and then what I could develop to get there, right? And that was really an important sort of moment. But it still links back to that original question of how can I be an effective person? How can I be effective in this planet before the day I die? How do I want to look back at my life and see what I've done, right? So I would say that is the glue.
That's a beautiful answer. That was on the spot, unprepared, and it was so beautiful. Thank you. So that was, I have learned a lot about you even more, and I absolutely, love it. So, we talked about, feminism, about ESG, how you started the conference 3 years ago and how it has evolved. You talked about, how to navigate between the cultures and expectation from the community and the family, when you came to Vietnam via China. You talk about, what you just talked now about, mapping your leadership skills and your leadership identity. And really all of it is really about underpinned by, your many cultural identity, that, you're going through. For the people who are listening to you now, if they want to connect with you, we will add your LinkedIn profile, your link down here so, they can connect with you directly. And in the meantime, for the people who are listening to us, if you really connected with this episode and you like the lens that we bring on to women, leadership and identity, especially in Vietnam, so please subscribe to Mosaic Mind. And there are more other amazing women, on the lineup, and we're already working up to season 8 already. So I'm May Holland. I was your host for today. Thank you for listening. Thanks very much, Van Lee, and see you around.
Thank you for having me.